I'm excited to welcome Dr. Leanna Fuller from Pittsburgh Seminary, where Reverend Dr. Leanna Fuller is the Joan Marshall Associate Professor of Pastoral Care. She's a graduate of Vanderbilt with her PhD and also her MDiv, and she's also a graduate of Furman University in her Bachelor of Arts. Her most recent book, I'm going to hold it up here. We've just been using it in the intro to pastoral care class, is called When Christ's Body is Broken, Anxiety, Identity, and Conflict in Congregations. And it is a truly rich book. It was published in 2016 with Withenstock. Fuller has earned numerous fellowships, awards, and honors. She was selected to participate in the 2016-2017 Wabash Center Workshop for Early Career Theological School Faculty, and she received the Louisville Institution Dissertation Fellowship in 2010-2011. Her most recent conference paper was entitled One Body, Many Parts, an Ecclesiology for Churches in Conflict, and that was presented at the AAR. Her ministry experience includes serving as an associate pastor of Oakland Christian Church in Suffolk, Virginia, where she coordinated youth ministry and Christian education programming. Fuller has also worked as chaplain resident at Riverside Regional Medical Center in Newport News, providing pastoral care for patients. Her family includes her spouse, the Reverend Scott Fuller, a UCC minister and chaplain, and their young son, Simon, as well. So it's with joy and gratitude that I welcome Dr. Fuller amongst us. I always find her work to be such a rich exploration beyond just platitudes or how-tos that litter the field of conflict studies. Dr. Fuller is looking deeply at the meaning of conflict in ways that really stand out to me. I've known her since we started our PhD programs in pastoral care around the same time. And I've always found you to be such a rich and generous conversation partner, Dr. Fuller. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Phil, for that really generous and gracious introduction. And hey to everybody who's out there. Good to see you. I'm going to minimize my screen a little bit so I can keep track of my notes. But I did just want to, before I sort of jump into what I have to say today, I did just want to thank you all again for taking the time to be here. I know this is a topic that is close to home for many folks, and I want to keep that in mind as we go. Because I know this isn't just an academic subject, so to speak, but it is something that affects many of us. So I'll just start today by saying that you may have seen from the title of the session today that I have chosen to frame my presentation and our conversation in terms of engaging difference, since that's something that all of us are challenged to do these days in our families, in our workplaces, our neighborhoods, and of course our churches. And I think it's especially important to talk about how to engage difference in our faith communities, because those are supposed to be spaces where we can be authentically known in our fullness. But I think many of us know that that can be really difficult to do, even and maybe especially in church. And to illustrate that, I'm just going to briefly share with you a story from my own pastoral experience that was actually one of the main reasons I started down this path of researching and writing about conflict in faith communities. And I know there are a few students possibly here from Dr. Helsel's class. And so if you've read the book, you may remember some aspects of this story, but I'll just share it briefly for those who may not have read it. So years ago, when I was serving on a pastoral staff, our congregation, which was a United Church of Christ congregation, went through a really major, intense conflict. It happened to be around issues of human sexuality, but many congregations go through intense conflicts around other things. But in our case, it was about human sexuality, and that's something that folks in a variety of denominations have also experienced, I know. And the conflict emerged very quickly. It escalated very quickly. And the congregation really became polarized almost overnight. And that made it really, really hard for us to work with the conflict. And by we, I mean especially the senior pastor and I, because we just weren't very well equipped for how to handle a conflict of that intensity. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that later when Dr. Helsel and I start having conversation. But one of the things that I really took away from that experience that has sort of led me into this work that I've now been doing for more than 10 years is just an awareness I had reflecting back on the experience I had in my congregation, that it felt as though our whole congregation, not just the pastoral staff, but the parishioners too, that we just didn't have much capacity for knowing how to talk to one another about differences that felt really important to us. And, you could think of a lot of things that would fall in that category, not just theology or politics, but other kinds of differences that really feel like they're at the heart of somebody's identity. And we just didn't seem to have much skill at doing that. And I think that's part of the reason why the conflict really became so intense so quickly. So after going through that experience in my own congregation where I was a pastoral leader, I really became even more convinced than I had probably been before that if we're going to aspire to be communities where people can bring their whole selves in relationship with one another as siblings in Christ, it's really important that we learn to engage each other's differences with care and respect, not with the aim of changing one another necessarily, but simply in order to understand one another better. And as you saw from the title of our session today, I referenced one body, many parts, which of course is alluding to 1 Corinthians 12. I've used that little phrase in other research papers and things that I've given because I think it's so pertinent to what we're talking about today. If you think about 1 Corinthians 12 and the metaphor of the body that Paul uses in that letter, one of the main points of that metaphor is that we need all the different parts in order for the body to function properly. And if we were to try to make all the parts be the same, the body is no longer the body that it was intended to be. So the way Paul puts it is, if the whole body were an eye, where would the hearing be? So in a similar way, if we think about the church as Christ's body and all of us as representing different parts of that body, any attempt to make us all be the same, whether it's the same in theological perspective, political position, racial, ethnic identity, whatever it would be, any attempt to sort of break down the differences and make us all the same is actually preventing us from being the body that God intended us to be. Which is not to say that we should only talk about differences and never talk about our commonalities. But my experience in church is we tend to like to do the opposite. We tend to like to talk about the things we have in common and sort of gloss over the differences because difference makes us feel uncomfortable, just to be honest. I'm going to say more about that in a few minutes. But from my point of view, what's really most important is not what our specific differences are necessarily, but how we engage and honor those differences that are among us. We can choose to do it in ways that are life-giving, or we can do it in ways that tear down and cause division and pain. And I think a lot of people have experience with that second way of engaging difference, especially in church. And that's why a lot of people end up leaving churches because they see conflict in a faith community as only having that destructive outcome. And so part of what I'm hoping to do in my work is to try to present some other kind of vision for how conflict in faith communities could be, how it could be a resource for growth and transformation rather than just something that has to split us apart. But if we want to even think beyond our own specific congregations or ministry settings, I also think that in order to minister most effectively to the larger communities of which we're a part, we do need to cultivate those skills of honoring difference, because if we're not able to honor the differences that exist within our own faith communities, where we've sort of voluntarily chosen to participate, and we already share a lot of the same beliefs, values, and commitments, how would we be able to connect with others who are not already part of our faith community and who may not share those things with us? So learning to honor difference and engage with others in meaningful ways across difference, I think, are the keys to building strong, lasting relationships, whether that's with our family members, friends, fellow church members, or members of the wider communities in which we participate. The longer I've worked on this topic, the more I've become convinced that honoring differences is not just a social or relational skill. It's a spiritual capacity, I think, that we can learn to develop. To put it another way, what I believe about God I think should have a lot to do with the way I relate to my fellow church member or my neighbor. So in that sense, I think we have a real opportunity in the church to practice honoring the differences among us as a way of embodying our spiritual commitments. If we say we love God, we have to show that we love each other, even across our differences. Otherwise, the truth is not in us. So, as I've said, I think we in the church would do well to start paying more attention to honoring the differences in our midst. I think we would do well to start thinking of this as one of the most important spiritual disciplines we can practice together. But it's not easy. In fact, one of the most challenging aspects of relating to other people is engaging difference. This is what I was alluding to a little earlier. We know from the discipline of psychology and other social sciences that human beings, as a general rule, feel most comfortable when they're with other people who are more or less like them in particular ways. Most of us, I think, would admit that we enjoy being with people who share common interests, values, and beliefs. Of course, we know that there are differences between us and the people we care about, family members, friends, fellow church members, but most of the time, those differences don't feel threatening to us. But sometimes we find ourselves in situations where the differences start to seem more dramatic. Maybe we're interacting with someone who comes from a really different background than we do, and we have very few shared experiences to draw from. Maybe we're talking with someone we know pretty well, but we suddenly discover a major difference between us about something that feels really important, like religion or politics. Or maybe we're just having a really strong disagreement with someone we know very well and that we love very much, and we just can't understand how that person sees something so differently than we do. These are all very normal experiences, but the truth is that for most people, these kinds of big, important differences make us feel pretty uncomfortable. In these kinds of situations, we may start to experience fear, anxiety, or defensiveness, and we may feel compelled to protect our position by arguing a point or trying to convince the other person they're wrong. The problem is that this kind of argumentation, at least in my experience, rarely helps to draw people together. More often than not, if people are feeling threatened and are acting defensively, the conversation very quickly becomes unproductive, and the relationship can even be damaged if it goes on too long. So one of the questions that I feel like we need to wrestle with as we think about this topic today is how we could imagine engaging differences with another person in a way that reflects our spiritual commitments. Or another way to put it is, how could we imagine making this kind of interaction into a spiritual practice? So one of the most helpful resources I've found in my own thinking about this is a book, and I'm going to hold up the book also. It's called Dignity, Its Essential Role in Resolving Conflict by Donna Hicks. And I want to start by saying, I think it's important to say that Donna Hicks is not a religious or a theological writer. She's a psychologist by training, and she spent much of her career working in the arena of international conflict resolution. But her basic idea in this book is that all conflict, in one way or another, stems from the violation of someone's dignity. And dignity, at least the way Hicks defines it in this book, is a birthright. It's something that each one of us has by virtue of being human. It's what gives us worth and value. It's what determines that we are deserving of care and attention. So it's not something that we can earn. It is already inherent within us. And when that sense of our innate worth and value is violated in some way, according to Hicks, we experience a very intense feeling of psychological and emotional threat. And we tend to become very defensive and even lash out at others. One of the very interesting things that Hicks shares in this book is that psychological threat is experienced in the body exactly the same way as physical threat. So whatever hormones or chemicals are released in your body, if you're being chased by a bear or something like that, those are the same things that get released when you feel psychologically or emotionally threatened, which gives us a window into why sometimes people react in the way they do in conflicts that feel really important or intense to them. Now, as I've said, Hicks is a psychologist. She's not a theologian, But I really believe that her idea of dignity as a fundamental aspect of being human has deep resonance with how we think about human beings within our Christian tradition. Whereas Hicks tends to talk about dignity as our birthright, in the church, we would probably talk about it in terms of being made in the image of God. And so part of what I believe we're called to do in our relationships with all other children of God is to find ways to honor their dignity, even if we experience them as very different from ourselves, or even if we disagree really strongly with what they're saying. So then the question to ask ourselves is, what would it mean to honor another person's dignity? For example, in a conversation where we're hearing someone express views that feel very challenging to our own. Well, Donna Hicks has some very particular ways that she talks about this in her book. She talks about them in terms of the 10 essential elements of dignity. Given our time limitations today, I won't try to walk through each one of those. I would just recommend the book to you to read in your own time. But I will share with you a couple of examples of the essential elements of dignity to try and give you a sense of what this might look like in practice. So the first one that I'm going to share with you out of this list of 10 is called benefit of the doubt. And this is the one that I feel is especially useful in the context of conflict or disagreement. And it's really just what the name implies. It just means starting with the premise that others have good motives and are acting with integrity. So in a situation of conflict, it means resisting the urge that many of us have to make accusations or assume someone else's motivations, and instead trust that the other person in the conversation is doing their best. So it's giving somebody the benefit of the doubt, maybe until such time as you have a reason not to, but it's starting from that place of assuming good motives on behalf of the other. The second essential element that I'll share with you as an example is called understanding. And this one goes hand in hand with benefit of the doubt. And again, it's something that at first it seems really simple, but it can be hard to do, especially if we're feeling attacked. So within Hicks's framework, understanding involves giving people the chance to explain and express their points of view and actively listening in order to understand them. The problem here, as I said, it seems very simple when you just say it like that, but the problem is that most of us are not as good at listening as we think we are. So we may need to practice how to listen well without interrupting, arguing, or making a rebuttal. Listening for understanding means we listen in a way that should allow us to be able to repeat our conversation partner's views back to them in a way that they would recognize. So Hicks gives a very powerful example of understanding in her book. She describes a situation where she was asked to consult with a company that was having a lot of issues around gender equity. And she was asked to come in and try to help, especially the women in that company, help their voices be heard and try to resolve some of the conflicts that were brewing there. So she describes a situation where a woman was speaking and describing how difficult her experience had been in that organization and how she had felt really dismissed and ignored by a lot of people, including her own supervisor. And as she's sort of trying to tell this story, one of her male colleagues interrupts and says, "Oh, I know the person you're talking about, and I think you're really misjudging him, and I really think he does care about your perspective." As you can imagine, the woman who was interrupted starts to get very defensive, and she starts to say things like, "Are you trying to tell me about my own experience now?" And there's really an intense kind of emotional thing that starts to happen between them. And Hicks, as the consultant in the room, chooses that moment to intervene, and she asks the two participants if they'd be willing to sort of take a step back and let her coach them into having a dialogue that's more based on her dignity model, with specific reference to understanding. So they agree, and she coaches the male colleague to start his comment over and to say to his teammate, instead of saying, "You're wrong," or "I think you're getting this wrong," he says to her, "I think I am not understanding what you're saying fully, because my experience of that person is really different, but I really want to understand how it is you have had that experience with this person. Can you tell me more?" So she basically coached him to move from a position of sort of knowing or assuming motives, instead to a place of curiosity and wanting to understand. And that completely changed the tenor of the conversation. And the female colleague was then able to sort of fully share her story, and they were able to get past that and really come to a place where they could affirm their respect for each other and work together more productively. So these are just two examples, benefit of the doubt and understanding of the essential elements of dignity that Hicks describes in her book. And as you can probably tell, they point to practices that all of us would do well, probably to implement in all our relationships, regardless of whether we're talking about disagreements in church or some other aspect of our lives. As I said earlier, these kinds of practices can be seen as spiritual disciplines that we could work on together in our faith communities to create more open environments where differences can be held and honored rather than being seen as a threat to our unity. So in addition to the spiritual practice of honoring dignity, I think there are some other things that congregations can do to try to engage difference in more constructive ways and hopefully avoid those really damaging kinds of conflict that we've all heard about in faith communities or maybe experienced ourselves. These are suggestions that have more of a communal rather than a strictly interpersonal dimension. So they may be especially helpful for those who are in various positions of leadership within their faith communities. And again, if you have read the book, you'll recognize some of these from the last chapter where I kind of point to some practices for faith communities as they're thinking about engaging difference and conflict in their midst. So the three suggestions are: first, acknowledge difference and anxiety; second, cultivate calm and connected leadership; and third, provide opportunities for all voices to be heard. So I'll just take a minute and say a little bit more about each of those before we move into some more conversation. So when I say acknowledge difference and anxiety, what I really mean there is trying to, first of all, surface differences that are in the group well before any conflict is brewing or any decision needs to be made. And so when I say difference there, I don't just mean theological difference or political or position on a decision. I'm actually referring to any kind of difference you can imagine, because as you know, in any group, there's going to be lots of those, whether it's race, ethnicity, culture, background, where we grew up, what kind of school we went to, what kind of profession we do. I mean, these are all just differences that we have as part of our life stories. And we have an expectation that other people's life stories are going to be different, right? So when we think about weaving those differences in to the just normal life of our faith community, you can imagine how we could sit around a table at a fellowship meal or a Bible study or spiritual formation gathering, and we could share aspects of our lives that will surface those differences, whether or not we're really intentionally doing that or not. But the more that we can do that, I think the more we will build awareness in ourselves and in the group that the group is not homogenous. You know, even though a lot of congregations are pretty homogenous racially, or even sometimes politically these days, there's still a lot of difference within those groups. The problem is that if we seem to be homogenous on one or two dimensions, it can sort of give the inaccurate impression that we're the same on all these other dimensions. And that's one thing that I saw happening in the church that I served. It seemed as though people thought, well, because we're all Christian, because we're all part of the same congregation, we're part of the same denomination, we must all think the same about these issues. And that just simply wasn't true. And, you know, even though intellectually, if you'd asked people, they probably would have admitted, oh, yeah, I'm sure, you know, there's difference of opinion here. It was like emotionally, they didn't know it. And so when these differences surfaced very suddenly, it felt surprising in a bad way to people. You know, it felt like a shock. And they were just caught off guard by it. And I remember one woman saying to me during that whole time of conflict in our church, you know, I've been going to church with so-and-so for 30 years, and I never knew she thought that. And I remember thinking, well, that's kind of sad, you know, that you've been going to church with someone for decades and you didn't really know them because you didn't talk about these things that were important. And I know in church we have a tendency to shy away from topics or differences that we experience as controversial. And I'm certainly not saying we should just go around and, you know, try to make people take stands on controversial topics all the time, because I don't think that would be helpful either. But if we sort of assume that everybody's going to check their opinions at the door and not bring them in with them. I think that actually contributes to more problems down the road, because then there's an assumption of sameness that just isn't true. So some way of servicing differences throughout the life of the church in all different ways can be really helpful, I think, because then people don't feel so surprised and they get practice in very low stakes environments. Just talking about, oh, you went to school there. Oh, you grew up in that area. Well, I grew up in a totally different, I grew up in the country. I grew up in the city. Those things can be talked about in a way that doesn't feel like there's the pressure of having to make some kind of decision or, take a stand on a really important issue. It's just a matter of engaging the things that make somebody else unique, which is something that most of us do all the time. But maybe we just don't practice it as often in church as we could. And then as far as acknowledging anxiety, this is just kind of a suggestion, especially for leaders, whether they are, the pastoral leader or other leaders in a group or congregation, is to just, when you see tension building or you sense that there's anxiety swirling, it can be really helpful just to name that rather than pretending that nothing's going on. But it can actually be really a transparent way of leading to say, I can sense that people are nervous about this, or that there's tension building around this particular issue. And I want you to know I'm paying attention to that. And we're going to find ways to talk about it. These are ways of kind of like having release valves, for the anxiety or the tension, so that it doesn't build to such a point where it explodes. I guess that's how I would put it. The second suggestion I mentioned a minute ago is cultivating calm and connected leadership. And when I say leadership there, I really mean that in a very broad sense. I don't just mean people who hold, official titles or offices, people who serve on session. Those are certainly all leaders in a faith community. But leaders can be anyone in a group who are able to come in with a lower level of anxiety, a higher level of kind of groundedness or centeredness, calmness, who are able to stay connected in a meaningful way with others in the group, even when they disagree. Right now, you all on this call can probably think of someone who fits that description, right? Somebody who, when they walk in the room, everybody kind of takes a deep breath and says, oh, good, so-and-so's here. Like, we know that there'll be this calming presence here in the room. That's what I would hope for most of us who aspire to be leaders in whatever respect in our communities. And that doesn't mean that we don't have anxiety inside. We're all going to feel nervous or tense inside when we're dealing with a situation of stress or crisis or conflict. But it is possible, I think, to feel that inside and to not necessarily spread it to everybody else. One of my professors in graduate school said, you can have your feelings without your feelings having you. And I think that's a very helpful way of thinking about it, is that I can experience what's happening in me as a clue as to what may be happening in the rest of the group. As I said, acknowledging the anxiety, but not necessarily using that as a way to sort of work everyone up or get things going to an emotionally intense place, but rather as a way of being transparent and saying, okay, let's engage what's happening here. So, basically this is the leader or leaders in a group who can bring their own calmness to a situation rather than telling other people to be calm, which pretty much never works, right? So it's bringing that presence, that sense of groundedness to a situation. And of course, that's not something we can just develop overnight necessarily. I think that takes a lot of internal work for most of us to build those capacities and skills. But if you are someone who is in a prominent leadership position in an organization or a congregation, you can look for those people and build that network and help them or invite them to join you in this work of helping the group to function better. And then my last suggestion for leaders is to provide opportunities for all voices to be heard. My experience in congregations especially is that when we have something big to decide or to discuss, we tend to have a large group meeting. And by large, I mean anything more than like 10 people, right? But like the whole group meets together. We have some people talk to each side of the issue, and then we have a vote, sort of like a school board meeting or something like that. And it's not that that in and of itself is bad. I think there are some issues that we can deal with very effectively that way. But when the issues are really, really important to people and they have a large emotional impact, I find that this actually can do more harm than good. First of all, because in a larger group, and again, anything over like maybe 8 people, there are some people who just simply will never speak out loud in a group that's large. They just don't feel comfortable speaking publicly. Therefore, you are automatically reducing the number of people that you're going to hear from. Similarly, in a large group situation like that, you tend to hear most from the people who are kind of at the edges of each end of the spectrum, right? Who feel most passionately on either side. So you end up not hearing from that large middle group, and you get a skewed sense of what the group's feeling really is. And then, as far as a vote, well, votes create winners and losers. And again, if it's something really important to people and they feel that they lost that vote, sometimes they just feel like they can't stay in the community. It was too high stakes for them, or they feel they've lost face by speaking passionately about something that then wasn't, didn't go in their favor. So in that respect, it's harmful to the group because it kind of automatically splits the group. So my feeling is that for a really important issue, the more important it is, the longer you should probably take to engage it. And you should probably find ways to provide multiple opportunities for people to have their voice heard. Most of the time, that's probably going to be some kind of a small group process where people can speak in a small group of peers. You can always have somebody take some notes that are not necessarily attached to names so that you can get a good sense of what is being said in all the different groups. And then, I think ideally you might like to try to have a process of communal discernment rather than a vote. I know in some cases, maybe you still need to have a vote, but there's actually good social science research on this, that if people feel that they got a chance to say their viewpoint and that it was heard and taken seriously, they're much more willing to support whatever the group's decision is, even if it's not what they themselves would have chosen. So I think the mistake we often make in churches is we rush to a vote because we think, well, that will dispel the anxiety because we'll have made a decision and it'll be over. But often the opposite is true, because it just builds anxiety for people to feel like, I didn't get a chance to have my say, and now the decision's made, and what do I do? So that's just kind of my suggestion there, is providing those opportunities as much as possible. Obviously, judgments have to be made. If it's a relatively unimportant decision, probably you don't need to have all these complicated small group processes, right? But if it's something really important, like whether or not to stay in your denomination, or something like that, you probably should have a longer process to give more time for the discernment to take place. And I always feel like I need to add, when I say letting all voices be heard, that is not the same thing as letting people bully each other. Sometimes I think people will say, you're not hearing me. And what they actually mean is, you're not giving me my way or doing what I want. And those are not the same thing. So sometimes it may be important for communities, ideally before a conflict erupts, to establish guidelines and expectations for how they're going to be together, in terms of their communication, their behaviors, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And as I said, ideally that would happen in a time of calm where you're not dealing with a conflict or a big decision. And then you can just plainly say, these are the expectations we have for one another, in our community, and then hold each other accountable to those. I know that's really easy to say and hard to do, but I think in the church we could do a lot better with that. I think we have a reticence often in congregations to set limits on each other when it comes to behaviors or ways of speaking that are destructive. And I think that's a place we can really grow. So I'm going to stop there. I feel like I've said plenty. And I will ask Dr. Helsel to jump in with whatever questions he has.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Fuller. And I felt like a sense of hope as you were talking. And I also felt really like the theological grounds of what you were doing and why it matters so much. I might just start with the intro question. Already I see some questions populating the chat.
Sure.
Looks like we're going to have some conversation. So this was a question I kind of had after reading your book, and now you have like a conflict expertise center that you work with now too at Pittsburgh. So I was just wondering, like, how do you help everyday like pastors who kind of have average pastoral care training maybe distinguish from healthy conflict that they can help with
Mm-hmm.
from something that kind of really requires outside help or outside intervention?
Sure. So, one of the ways that I think about this is in terms of emotional intensity. So there was a writer named Speed Lees, Leas. He wrote a lot in the sort of 80s and 90s for the Alban Institute. Was kind of a church leadership, church conflict guy. And he, in some of his writings, has this little diagram of a pyramid where it shows the different levels of kind of intensity of conflict. He divides them into 5 levels, and the first 2 he describes as a problem to solve or a disagreement. And those sound like, pretty common scenarios we can think of in our congregations. We have a problem we need to solve together, or maybe it's risen to the level of a disagreement where people have taken different positions. His theory was that if you're at one of those 2 levels, most pastoral leaders can deal with that okay on their own. It's when you kind of move up the ladder one more rung to what he calls contest. Or another way of thinking about this is when there's a shift from we're all trying to work together to solve a problem or to sort out a disagreement to I want my side to win. Like that shift in emotional intensity is where he says leaders ought to be thinking about maybe getting some support. And then, once it moves up even higher where there is, just really a lot of intense behavior and communication and things like that, like clearly those are times when most people are not going to be equipped. I think that looking back on my own experience, part of what was so hard is it went so quickly from 1 to like 4, and we just weren't as leaders ready to deal with that. And that is one thing I wish we had done is gotten some kind of consultation with someone. Depending what your tradition or your particular situation is, it might be judicatory leaders that could come in. I know some denominations have, teams in their local presbyteries or whatever that can help, or there are conflict transformation centers of various kinds that provide consulting. And I realize that's a big ask in certain ways too, because those kinds of things take money and things like that. But I think just anytime you see sort of these signs of emotional intensity or the group starting to split, and that, you can sort of see that starting to happen when the positions taken are more strident. People start personalizing the issue, like if this person would just leave, everything would be fine. Or everything's like in an us them kind of way of talking. Vague assertions about, they always do this, or you always do that. These are all kind of telltale signs that the group is starting to split. And those are usually warnings, I think, that people need to perhaps be thinking about getting some assistance. The other thing I would say is that if the conflict itself is centered on the pastoral leader, that may also be to look for some support, because even in the situation that I went through, the conflict was not really about me and the other pastoral leader, but it was about the vote ended up being about denominational membership. And we did not feel we could take a neutral position on that because that was the denomination we were ordained with. So some people experience that as us, trying to control the outcome of the conflict. So I think there's times when leaders have to say, okay, maybe I can't be seen as a neutral facilitator here, and I need to get some outside support.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Dr. Fuller. And that actually kind of leads to the first question from the chat.
Well, I would say communal discernment itself is probably not my specialty. I mean, I feel like I know more about kind of the sort of the precursors to that. However, I do have colleagues on the faculty at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary who would do a lot of this work, particularly with context of missional leadership and communal discernment. So Professor Scott Hagley, Professor Roger Owens are both people who do a lot of work with this. But I will just say, from a general perspective about communal discernment, this is not a specific strategy or method, which is, I know, is what you're asking about. But I do think, just from a general perspective, I have seen ways in which just the intentionality of a process and the willingness to give it time and to place it within a framework of spiritual commitment and values really helps the discernment process. That's my observation. So in my book, I tell the story of another church, not the one that I pastored, a different one, that was trying to make a decision about worship services, which on the surface seems like it shouldn't be that big of a deal to decide to go from 3 services to 2. But it was a big deal for all kinds of reasons that I try to describe in the book. And the pastors there, I thought, very wisely resisted the urge to just sort of make a unilateral decision based on how many people were attending each one. They sort of had this sense that doing that would be problematic for a variety of reasons. So they instead sort of built this intentional process where they had representatives from each of the services. They took their time. They opened every meeting with prayer and sort of reflection on scripture. They did a lot of processes where they made sure that people could have their voices heard fully without being interrupted. They use a specific method called functional subgrouping, which I describe in the book. It actually comes out of group therapy, but it's where people who already agree with each other are allowed to speak to one another about their position. And everyone who has a different position just listens on the outside. And this is a really good way to get all of the ideas in the room without people trying to sort of argue or, convince each other. But they did that process over a period of months. And at the end, they sort of came to a decision consensually that truly I don't think they ever would have come to before. Partly I think that was probably the movement of the Holy Spirit, but I think it was also because they used this longer discernment process where they did not automatically assume the outcome, and they gave everybody an opportunity to speak into it. So that's kind of what I was saying before about the opportunity for all voices to be heard. That particular church, I think, did that really well. And so in the end, I think there were probably still some people who left over the decision, but it's probably a lot fewer than would have otherwise. And I interviewed people from that church for my book, and there were more than one of them said to me, this wasn't really the outcome that I would have picked if it were up to me alone. But because I really felt like my views were considered, and I saw how the process had such integrity, I was willing to support it. So I think just from a general point of view, that way of walking through a process of discernment with time and intentionality and spiritual discipline, I think helps a lot. That's a really good question. I'm not sure if I've ever thought about it sort of in terms of like temperament like that. I think sometimes it may depend on what your goal is. So, if it's really about just kind of mixing people up and getting them to talk to different folks that they may not normally, see, you might do it that way in terms of, not putting everybody from the same Sunday school class or the choir together, but trying to mix them around. If you're talking about something that's a little bit more heated, that has a little bit more emotional valence or intensity, I think part of that is knowing your community and knowing, like, will it be a good idea to start with putting people with different perspectives in a group together? Or might it be better to do more like a functional subgrouping kind of approach where you ask people to kind of self-identify with a position and then put them in groups together? That's actually what the Methodist church I wrote about did. They first let people who already agree with each other talk to each other separately in their own groups. And then they brought them out and had them talk to each other in a public way with others listening. And then later they mixed up the groups. So that would be one way to do that. I do think when there are issues that are more intense or potentially controversial, it's really a great idea to have a facilitator in groups that are kind of assigned to help moderate the discussion. And again, you'd probably want to give a little bit of training to those people to talk with them about, how to listen well and how to help manage a group and things like that. Because I do think sometimes that's where some of our attempts at conversation go awry. Even the larger meetings that we have. I think back to some of the ones we had at my own church when we were going through the conflict, and looking back, I'm thinking, oh man, we really did not set that up for success, because we did not think through, how people were going to be chosen to speak, or how long they would get to speak, or what kinds of comments we would allow. I mean, we just didn't think through any of that. So I think with any small group process, it's really good to think about, what's the goal? And that would probably help guide your decision about who to put together, or whether you would just let people self-select. Really good question. And I do think that there are even churches in the US that are kind of like this too. The church that I served even was a little bit like this, in the sense that a lot of people in the church were related to each other. But I think in certain cultures, in certain contexts, this is even more true. And it does make things more complicated, I think, for the pastoral leader, because they're trying to manage the dynamics in the church while knowing that some of the conflicts or some of the things that are happening are actually really taking place outside of the church building, right? And they're being, as you said, brought in. I think the general principle that I think of there is from family systems theory, which is to say that the leader in any group, whether it's a congregation, a school, or a family, whoever is kind of trying to be a leader and help affect the system positively, has to try to stay connected with all the different parts of the system, without getting too drawn into any one part of the system's issues. So I can see how when there's family conflicts, it would be very easy to kind of get drawn to one side or the other, or, you're taking so-and-so's side or you're taking so-and-so's side. And as the pastoral leader, it can be very easy to do that, because sometimes certain people in those family systems have a lot of power in the congregation, and it can be very easy to try to placate somebody. So I think the challenge for the leader is to try to stay rooted in their own values and principles, and take their positions that they think are right, while also staying connected to the other people in the system, even though they may disagree, even though they may not you may not be doing everything as the leader that the person wants. That's, I think, one of the major challenges for leaders everywhere, is to understand how to be myself fully, and to take the positions I think are right, to do what I think is right as a leader, and to stay connected without sort of getting drawn in to these other conflicts that may really have nothing to do with me as a leader. Like, as you're saying, they're really about stuff going on in the family. So one thing the leader can do in those circumstances is try to gently lead people back to the source of their conflict, right? To say, well, it sounds like that disagreement is really with, your uncle, or is really with your sister. And how about we think together about how you could talk to them about that, or work on that together, rather than, being the person that, okay, I'm the pastor now, I have to go try to solve this problem between these two other people, which usually doesn't work very well, because most of the time we can't affect two other people's relationship with each other. We can only affect our relationship with each of those people. But working on our relationship to each party in the conflict is usually the best way to go, because then we don't get cast into, well, you're on that side or you're on this side. But instead we say, no, I'm the pastor to everybody. I'm connected to each person in this system. I don't know if that helps. I know it's very complicated. If somebody came to me and was like, hey, can you as the pastor, go talk to my uncle / relative / whoever, and solve this problem for me, basically, which is sometimes what happens to us as leaders. We get drawn into someone else's conflict. I think I would want to say something like, let's think together about how you could talk to that person, and I mean, depending on your relationship, you might even offer to go with them for support. But that's very different from, hey, you go talk to this person so that I don't have to do it, right? That's kind of what I was getting at.
Well, people have mentioned in the chat Peter Steinke's work, and one person said, and this could be the last comment / question from the group, and then I'll have one more for you too.
Okay, sure.
Regarding the need to take time and frame significant conversations as with spiritual practice, how do you build support for this approach? My experience is that folks can agree to this approach, but when it gets down to implementation, they will want to shortcut this process and move to resolution.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And it is a very hard thing to hold in tension, because the thing is, from my perspective, whenever the issue is one that creates more emotional intensity and anxiety is high, that same anxiety and pressure is going to make people want to resolve it quickly. So it's like, so the very same thing that I think means you should take longer to make a decision is the same thing that's going to make people want to do it more quickly. So I don't think there's any magic formula for this. I think it may partly be a culture change thing which could take a long time to develop, but it could be a matter of opening conversations well in advance of any particular conflict, during a period of peace or calm in the organization or the congregation, to say, let's reflect together on how we make decisions here. And, I've been thinking about how sometimes one way of making decision may be really effective, but it may not be for something else that we may face in the future that's really tricky or intense. And so let's think together about how we might want to do that. What are the kinds of things that we would want to take more time with? And that might actually get people kind of their wheels turning in a time when they're not feeling threatened or activated, to kind of ponder like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Now, it doesn't mean that even if they all, as you say, agree to it in theory, that when you get to it, they might not still resist. But I do think maybe planting the seeds and kind of nurturing that, or maybe modeling some small examples of how to do it, to take a little bit longer process with something, maybe not months, but, a few weeks or something, and modeling, okay, let's reflect together on scripture and, pray over this, for a few weeks together and make a decision. That might model something that could kind of take root. I think part of, the pandemic revealed how for many of this, we didn't have those skills, because when we needed to make decisions, people were like, what do we do? We're not used to having to do this without, these other frameworks in place. And I think it might make it easier for when we do have to make decisions a little more quickly, to have some of that groundedness and that relationality built up over time. But I still think the leaders are going to have to be prepared, even if everybody has said, yeah, we'll never make a big decision, overnight, without taking the time we need. Probably some people still will want to. But that could maybe be a part of the conversation too, to say, hey, here's the pros and cons of doing that, and let's really think this through together.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fuller. I just love your rich ecclesiology. You show that this is not just an optional task, but it has to do with our very nature as a church. And you show through your use of dignity just what's at stake as we relate to one another. I think it's so easy in the conflict process to forget some of this. I was wondering at the end if you could give us a kind of I don't know, either what are some practices for self-care if you find yourself in a season of conflict? I know some people on the call are kind of currently in the middle of a lot of conflict at their churches, or just a kind of blessing for if conflict is or has been tender for people in this group in the past. What would you want to say to them in closing?
Yeah. So I'll start with the self-care piece. I think just generally speaking, whatever self-care practices are helpful to you, I would certainly continue doing those if you're in a season of conflict. But you may find that you need to do them with more intentionality or more frequency than you ordinarily would, just as any time of heightened stress or anxiety. And I think conflict falls into that. So when you're dealing with a conflict, especially an intense one, I would think it could be an especially important time to seek out professional support, whether that is counseling or therapy, spiritual direction, coaching, as well as maybe more informal professional supports, like connecting with a mentor or colleagues who can kind of support you in your ministry and help you see, where you're doing well, or maybe even help you see some places you could grow. That could be a useful thing to do. I think when you're going through a period of conflict, especially an intense one, it can feel very consuming. And so a good part of self-care might be during a season like that to find things you enjoy doing that have nothing to do with work, where you're completely disconnected from your professional obligations. And I realize that can be hard for pastors, but I think it's really important to have spaces that are life-giving and fulfilling, that are not related to our professional identity, especially if you're in a situation where you feel like your professional position could be threatened or you could lose your job. That's a very stressful place to be, obviously, but all of us are more than our job. We're whole people apart from any particular job. So I think nurturing that, those interests, those creative outlets, and then setting appropriate boundaries, of course, I think is a really important part of self-care, whether it's just boundaries on your space and time, boundaries on how you will allow people to speak to you or not. I mean, that goes back to the sort of behavioral expectations piece we were talking about earlier. All those kinds of things, to me, fall under the rubric of self-care, because they're a way of protecting oneself, and giving oneself space, maybe is a better way of saying it, to live fully into our whole selves, our best selves. And of course, spiritual practices, whatever spiritual practices you have that sustain you, you maybe need to rely on those even more, whether that's prayer, meditation, Lectio Divina, kind of scriptural reflection practices, perhaps talking with others about scripture or about your spiritual life. And I think many times people who are religious leaders need to do those things in spaces other than their own ministry setting, because being in charge of things is not really quite the same as being a participant. So maybe finding a midday or midweek, midday Taizé service at a church down the street where you can just go and be a participant, or a Bible study in the community that you could be a participant rather than always having to lead. I think those are all things that could be helpful. And as far as a blessing, I would just say, I think, conflict is a really normal part of life. It doesn't mean that you have failed as a leader if your church is in conflict. In fact, even if the conflict is really intense and damaging, more than likely the dynamics for that were set up long before you came there. So it really often has very little to do with any one person or any one decision that's been made, but it's more about systemic dynamics. And every leader is going to have to decide, whether or not they're able to address those dynamics in their current situation or not. And sometimes I think the discernment the leader has to make is about whether to stay. And of course, that's painful, but it can be a really important life-giving decision for oneself. I would like to think that most of the time conflicts can be addressed without having to go that far, right? But I do think, conflict in itself is not bad, and it can be a real opportunity for growth for the group, if it's handled well, and if we develop a culture that doesn't see it as threatening or something to be feared. So I guess that's the last thing I would say.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Fuller. I've really appreciated you being with us today. And I sense that your topic is so timely.
Mm-hmm.
And I can sense also from people's participation, it's been meaningful for them as well. So we're deeply grateful for you and for the ways that we've experienced the fruits of the Spirit through your work today. So I'm really grateful for your ministry in conflict work and conflict studies. It can't be easy being
Well, thank you.
all the time. So
Thank you
thanks
so much.
to us.
It's been wonderful to be here. Thank you all.